What if Chaos Space Marines but on super dangerous mode? Let's talk through the brutal rules of this warband and why they might be the most competitive Chaos Space Marine army right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Space Marines and more specifically focusing on the twisted mutative freaks of the spider, with a look at the Creations of Bile and the Chaos Space Marine Codex. In the latest Chaos book, the support for Renegade warbands was a little bit on the thin side. It was only these guys and the Red Corsairs that got any rules, but the rules that they did get were fairly decent, a few less options than the big legions with a lot of heritage, but still some decent support nonetheless. So the Creations of Bile army list basically represents the followers of Fabius Bile in Warhammer 40k. I'm sure a lot of people watching this will be already familiar with him, but this guy's basically a fallen apothecary of the Emperor's children, now gone renegade, and has gone on his own little quest to create new improved Space Marines, subjecting his minions to twisted experiments, and always seeking to enhance the flesh, strength and senses of his charges. He's well renowned as a bit of a schemer, selling his services to the highest bidder, or making war when he specifically wants to recover one specific thing, and he takes to the field with his own band of followers, a ragtag warband of bulked up monstrosities, pledged to his cause. Currently in 9th edition 40k, they do seem like they're one of the strongest Chaos factions around. If there is one sub-faction that seems to have been taking an inordinate amount of success at tournaments for Chaos Space Marines, it's these guys. The current sub-faction win rate I believe is something like around 55%, much higher than the Chaos Space Marines average of 50. I guess in the lore perhaps it's a bit of a niche faction. It probably means that you're just mostly getting people who are playing the army for the rules as opposed to the theme. So at least in tournaments and things it might be a fairly selective group of more competitive players. Still though, even accounting for this, they do seem very dangerous. They've got some really big advantages with fights in death and advance and charge on a stratagem, and their core rules just seem to fit very well with what Chaos Space Marines want to do anyway. If you wanted to try out the sub-factions rules, it does seem like it would be a good count size for many melee-centric warbands. You don't actually need to field Fabius Bile himself, and the rules do seem to lend themselves to a Chaos force that just wants to hurtle towards the enemy and then hit them very, very hard. Let's get into their rules then, and first up we'll start with their Legion trait. Experimental Enhancements gives every single model +1 move, +1 to their strength, and also if they haven't fought this phase, then they get to fight in death if they're killed. First up, the movement is just generally helpful. 1 inch extra isn't everything, but occasionally that is going to make the difference of whether or not you make charges, and every charge that you make or don't have to CP reroll is a bit of a victory. It's perhaps particularly nice on slower units like Terminators and getting them up the field, but pretty solid on even fast things like say Possessed or Warp Talons. They'll be hurtling along at a pretty crazy rate. The +1 strength is also very, very nice as well. A lot of Chaos Space Marine units tend to be more mid-strength units, maybe having a strength of around 4 or 5. For units like Chaos Terminators or Possessed, that will be getting them up to strength 6, wounding things like Custodes on 3s and Toughness 3 infantry on 2s. And I think it's particularly good for units like Warp Talons that are strength 4. Going from strength 4 to strength 5 is a pretty massive breakpoint, particularly with their reroll wounds roll. That will mean that they're even wounding Toughness 8 things most of the time. Finally, and perhaps the most important bit of the trait, is the thing that allows you to fight in death. Against some armies this is just going to be absolutely brutal, and it means that if the enemy needs to remove the unit in combat, they're going to be taking some pretty hefty damage when they do. Some armies are going to deal most of their damage at range, which is all well and good, but some armies will basically have to try and take out your Chaos Space Marines in combat. And say with units like Possessed, Warp Talons or Terminators being fairly dangerous, it does seem like they're going to drag down a fair amount of the enemy's best and boldest when they get killed. Say for example, if you had a Sister Battle Repentia squad charge in and basically delete a unit of Possessed, you'd probably be odds on to kill the Repentia squad in return with the strikes back. Pretty massive when they might have already caused a fair amount of damage in your turn. Overall, it's a great faction trait, beats out quite a lot of the legions. For raw power, I feel like perhaps only the Word Bearers come close with their mortal wound protection and their reroll hits. Next up, their secondary is Specimens for the Spider, a Purge the Enemy one where you get victory points for killing units in melee, 3 victory points if you kill a character or monster, or 2 victory points for killing a different unit. It seems like a pretty reasonable one to me, provided your opponent either has a reasonable amount of characters or monsters. I think you want to get at least 1 turn when you're scoring both parts of it, but otherwise, provided you're charging into melee, it should be one that you never really score massively low on. As a bonus, if you happen to be fighting Astartes units, you also get a bonus victory point at the end of the battle, provided you killed something. Overall pretty good, provided your opponent's got at least some of the right targets. Next up we have Stratagems, and the creations have 4. First up for 1 CP there's Monstrous Visages. This one is a core Demonkin or character unit. When it's attacked in melee it gets -1 to hit, so it's basically a little bit more survivable. Not bad, though not really too much to say about it. Has a little bit more toughness when you need it in melee. Going to be best against things that don't hit particularly well in the first place, say units that hit on 4s. Taken Alive is a very fun and fluffy but situational one. You need to kill the enemy warlord in melee, and it makes the entire enemy army -1 leadership. They can't use the insane bravery stratagem, and can't reroll morale rolls for any reason for the rest of the game. Very fun, but kind of niche to be honest. Maybe against a leadership susceptible army like orcs, and you happen to take out the war boss early for some reason. Next for 1 CP there's the Masters Are Watching. 1 infantry unit within line of sight of a character gets to counters within range of their aura abilities, so they basically get to broadcast them across the battlefield. It only applies to the Lord, Champion, or the Dark Apostles leadership buff, so it's kind of a bit limited. It's really just going to amount to reroll 1s to hit or wound for 1 CP. Maybe it could be borderline worth it on a really big melee squad that you need almost every bit of melee damage out of. I don't see it being used very often though. Finally, and by far the best in my opinion, is Auto Stimulants. 1 core unit gets to advance and charge. Really very nice in my opinion. This is great for propelling something like a big brick of Terminators towards combat very quickly, particularly combined with that extra movement. A standard Chaos Terminator squad might well have an average charge threat range of around 12 inches. With this one, the Creations of Bile one goes up to a big 16 or 17 inches, a whole load better, and you'd have a lot more reliability with making charges. I think for the main reasons to play Creations of Bile, the best abilities are the Experimental Enhancements trait, this Auto-Stimulant stratagem, and perhaps the secondary as the main reasons to actually play the army. Otherwise though, there are a few different character upgrades on offer. 3 Warlord Traits, Surgical Precision, Prime Test Subject, and Twisted Regeneration. Surgical Precision allows your 4+ hit rolls to auto-wound the enemy and gets their AP improved by -1. I guess this one's fairly nice. Skipping out the wound reroll in general is pretty good, though you can get similar with that Golax Nurgalax if you want to, and that happens to every hit, not just some of them. I guess the AP's not bad though if you're against Armour of Contempt things. Next up, Prime Test Subject gives you +1 strength, toughness and wound, a general all-round character boost. Maybe it could be fun for a tanky Demon Prince or something. Ideally I think this will be quite good on a Lord Discordant as well, but unfortunately it tips you over the wounds threshold, so it would mean that your model will be directly targetable, so not best to use on that one. Finally, Twisted Regeneration is a 2+ chance to regenerate on death at the end of the phase with D3 wounds remaining. Not at all bad on a fighty character, basically to get back up when you die and have another go. Sometimes this could be really powerful if the opponent has to kill them in either the shooting or the assault phase, and this basically guarantees that they survive till the next turn. I feel like it might be a bit situational though. Sometimes it could be really devastating, sometimes it's just not going to make too much difference. I think you could argue it might be better just to make the character better and stronger the first time they're around, rather than gambling on a second go. Still though, I do feel that literally all 3 of these seem usable, but they do face some very stiff competition from the other Chaos Warlord traits. Flames of Spite is particularly good. Otherwise they also get 3 different relics as well. The Helm of All-Seeing is a nice command point farming one, a 5+ chance to gain a CP when an opponent uses a stratagem. It seems a very reasonable one to throw in, to be honest. It is likely to pay off itself over the course of the game. The Living Carapace can give one model a turn of being very tanky. Once per game when they're attacked in a phase, they get to change any damage characteristics to 1, so I guess in theory you'd have to wound them 7 times to kill them that phase if they were a Chaos Lord and Terminator armor. It's pretty good, though generally things like Demon Princes and Lord Discordant are some of the best things worth protecting, and it is a bit of a shame that it can't go on them. Finally there's the Hypergrowth Bolt. A bolt weapon makes a single attack against a non-vehicle. It becomes AP -1 and damage D3 +3, plus it automatically wounds the target as well. Not a terrible shooting option. I guess the idea would be to try and hit a monster or a character with a bad save, but that low AP does make it a bit questionable whether it's going to really do much. If anything's rocking Armour of Contempt or 2+ save, it's not going to have much chance of inflicting that damage. Out of these 3, I feel like the Helm of All-Seeing is by far the best. Most armies are going to be spending a fair amount of stratagems over the course of the game. I feel like you've got a very good chance of being in CP profits by turn 2 or turn 3, though the upfront cost might be a touch painful in Nephilim. Finally, for unique options, we have of course Fabius Bile himself, a 90-point Agent of Chaos unit that you can either run here or with that keyword he can potentially slot in with other legions. As a character choice, you would probably expect him to be pretty strong in this army, but unfortunately for some reason Games Workshop's given him rules that just don't really quite make him justified, and it does seem that just about every single competitive list tends to leave him at home. He's a bit more of a fun and fluffy choice if you're more playing the army for the lore. Kind of a bit sad though, it's a bit of a shame that they didn't manage to give him good rules that actually makes you want to run him in his very own army. Stat line wise, he's kind of similar to a Chaos Lord on foot. He does get a base strength 5, 6 wounds and 6 attacks, most of which will be made with his Rod of Torment, an AP -2 and damage 3 melee weapon, plus he's got a fun little needle pistol as well that has a fairly decent punch against things like Space Marines. He gets 4 more anti-infantry attacks with the Chirurgeon as well, so certainly isn't useless in melee, but lack of AP will mean that he's perhaps struggling against hard targets. The bit that perhaps lets him down a bit, outside of fun and fluff purposes, is his Enhanced Warriors rule. At the end of your movement phase, Fabius Bile gets to do an action where he targets a Traitoris Astartes core infantry within 3 inches of him, and basically gives them a little augmentation from his medical tricks. You roll a random d3, and they get either +1 strength, +1 toughness, and +1 attacks. While his little Surgeon Acolyte minion still lives, he gets to roll 2 dice and pick the best. You'd want to target a close combat unit with this, as otherwise the attacks and strength options would be wasted, though perhaps the toughness has the best value overall, as that's just a very solid boost. The big problem with this though is that it has to target a core unit that doesn't have a Mark of Chaos already, and unfortunately this just means that it's kind of competing with simple and easy to access upgrades that most squads would want to take. Say for example, if you wanted to use his augmentations on a big Terminator unit, he could have a pretty reasonable chance of getting +1 toughness all game long, or boosting their melee by a little bit, but I'm just not sure it really compares with say taking the Mark of Slanesh, allowing them to get psychic spells for 5+ feel no pain, getting the Apostle Prayer for advance and charge maybe, plus the guaranteed helpful fights first. Access to those things only costs 15 points, whereas for this you have to buy a whole character and then also have them set up next to each other. The same goes for most things worth augmenting, and he can't target any Demonkin with it. Legionaries, Barkers and Chosen also seem like pretty mediocre targets as well, because as well as passing up a mark you'd also be passing up the icon as well, so that's basically 2 very good buffs for 20 points, plus the keyword allows you a whole host of other options too. I think really if they wanted to see the rule get used a bit more, it would have to be able to apply to marked up units as well. All the abilities that you get would have to be more reliable or significantly better. I think if maybe you could guarantee the +1 toughness, then people might be a bit more tempted, but otherwise he's competing with some other very good HQ slots, and the only major thing that you're getting out of Fabius is his melee profile, which is okay but not standout. Don't get me wrong though, I'm sure a lot of people will include him just because the model's awesome, and of course it makes sense to have him leading his own creations, but I can see why more optimised lists might just leave him at home. So if I was putting a Creations of Bile army together, here are just a few of the stronger picks that I would be thinking about most. Obviously with unit picks, just about every single thing that fights in combat is well worth a mention. The movement, extra strength and fights in death are all pretty brutal, and so is the advance and charge for core units. I feel like perhaps some of the most standout units for Creations of Bile are Possessed and Warp Talons. Normally as Demonkin units they've got limited options for what sort of things you can buff them with, and both of these guys can happily use every single part of the traits. It gets them to move monstrously quickly. Extra strength is loved by both of them, particularly the Warp Talons going to strength 5, and after they've hit their target, if your opponent needs to kill them in melee, they're going to drag down a fair few more wounds off them when they die. Otherwise, Terminators are a really top choice for Chaos Marines in general at the moment, and Creations of Bile seem like an absolutely great option for them. They can still do the Slanesh Master of Possession thing for 5+ feel no pain, extra toughness, and regenning models, but getting the extra movement and advance and charge I think is a really massive benefit for them. If you know that there's a good chance of getting charged anywhere within 17 inches of them, then they're going to be a lot harder to ignore. Otherwise, combat characters again are worth a shout. All the benefits will help them out as well. Perhaps the popular Demon Prince with the Golax Nurgle relic, the Lord Discordant who generally fights hard in any army, and I feel that the Master of Executions is pretty relevant as well. A big strength 8 swing with that axe is very brutal. Otherwise, beyond these, just about any strong standard Chaos Space Marine pick is fine. Abaddon the Despoiler makes it into loads of lists. A few cultists for objectives is never a bad thing. Things like Venom Crawlers or other demon engines, and maybe a few standard Legionnaires on the troops side. You could have them swinging very hard with Khorne marked ones all the way up to strength 6 AP2. As mentioned, Fabius Bile really doesn't make it onto this list of good stuff. There's a lot of competition for HQ slots in the Chaos Codex. Out of the character upgrades, I must admit, I think that the standard Warlord traits from Core Codex Chaos Marines are probably more relevant than the Fabius Bile ones. Flames of Spite is absolutely monstrous on a lot of characters, and particularly so on Lord Discordant, and Hatred Incarnate can have a fair bit of synergy with certain units, say the Demon Prince with Golax, or perhaps a Master of Executions to try and fish for those big mortal wounding hits. The demon weapons are generally pretty excellent value as well, and all of these might get the chance to strike an additional time if the enemy has to kill them in combat. You could have a very powerful character swinging again in death with whatever you've upgraded them with. Out of the creation specific stuff, I feel like the farming CP with the Helm of All-Seeing seems pretty reasonable, and I think that all three of the Warlord traits are usable for combat characters, but I feel like the standard Warlord traits perhaps beat them out a bit. Maybe Twisted Regeneration is one of the more interesting. Finally, out of the stratagems, the advance and charge is great, as is the -1 to hit in combat if you happen to be against the right thing. Finally, I thought we'd just quickly round up with one strong list. There have been a fair few Bile lists doing well at tournaments recently, but this one seems like a very scary example by Zach Nelson, who used it to take first at the Harvester of Souls tournament. The list is made up of a Creations of Bile battalion backed up by Abaddon in a Supreme Command. The list is very character heavy. Abaddon the Despoiler leads the way with his massive melee profile, 4 rerolls for a core unit or himself, and potentially makes the army even faster and more threatening, making the Terminators have an extra +1 to their charge rolls if they need it. There's then a Winged Nurgle Demon Prince with the Golax Relic for the auto-wounding and bypassing wound caps. He has the Hatred Incarnate traits to allow him to reroll hit rolls as well, so should be hitting with just about most of those, plus gets an extra attack. Pretty brutal damage there, as he's usually going to be landing 7 odd wounds at damage 3 on the opponent. He's also got Prescience as well, which I guess could go on the Terminators. There's then a Dark Apostle with Illusory Supplication. That one I guess would be on the Terminators again, so -1 to hit and no rerolls against them. There's a Master of Possession, which is Tzeentch for the Eye of Tzeentch, +1 to psychic tests, and some powers are hard to deny. He'd be able to cast the +1 toughness and regenerate dead models within the unit with Pact of Flesh. He'd be a little bit more likely to be able to cast the +1 strength and toughness with mutated invigoration. That could make those Terminators a crazy strength 7 with that. Pretty brutal damage output against vehicles with those accursed weapons. Then rounding off the cast of characters, there's a Master of Executions with the Mantle of Traitors. The Mantle gives you a free epic deed, but also reroll hit rolls. That should allow him to fish for those big 6s that deal mortal wounds, and it's just a very cheap and scary close combat character. Hitting at strength 8 with the rest of the attacks certainly won't hurt him. Then going into squads to fill out the troop selections, there's 2 cultist mobs armed with the firearms, pretty nice for actions and objective work. There's 1 unit of legionaries with Slanesh Mark and the Balefire Tome. It looks like they're here to put the 5+ Feel No Pain power on the Terminators, though I guess they could switch it to doing it on themselves if it makes sense. Then there's the big block of Terminators that just about half the list looks like it's buffing. Slanesh Mark's Terminators with 2 Chain Fists, 2 Reaper Autocannons and a Power Fist, plus the Black Rune of Damnation for -1 to wounds. These guys just have so many crazy layers of defense that they're almost never going to get killed by anything efficiently, and even if the opponent does make a massive amount of effort to deal damage to them, they might just regrow it back with Pact of Flesh. I guess it's maybe a bit more viable to have this amount of investment on one unit if it can be moving around the board quite quickly with the advance and charge from the Creations of Bile stratagem. Finally, and other scary threats running around the board, there's 3 units of 5 Possessed Marines, which will be moving 10 inches and hitting at strength 6, and then a big unit of 8 Warp Talons, all be hitting on strength 5s, and all the Demonkin will be fighting on death when they're killed by enemy units in combat. Overall, a ridiculously scary core centre to the list, with Abaddon in tow, and then a whole bunch of nasty mauling damage units running around and just making very efficient use of the Legion trait. Looks very solid, and looks like it will be quite good for doing the Creations of Bile secondary as well for killing units. So with a look at a strong list out of the way, I think that just about brings us to the end of our look at Creations of Bile. Let me know what you make of the army down in the comments below. Have you tried them out on the tabletop? And how does it feel to play with or against them? If you'd like to see more like this, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be keeping the regular videos coming. I'm sure we'll have far more for the Ruinous Powers, including looks at some of the other legions. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.